about the difference actually between social media and then real life for high performance.
Mhm.
I'm intrigued. What do you see as those distinctions between someone who's showing up on social media and an actual real high performer? What's the difference that you see? Welcome, everyone, to the main journey, a way for you to join me on a learning journey through life. My name is Samuel Main, and today we welcome Dr. Carla Fowler to the show. Welcome, Carla, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Samuel.
I'm excited for this. Carla, you're the founder and managing director of THAXA, which is an executive coaching firm that helps people achieve big goals through performance science. Carla, you grew up on Mercer Island and attended Brown University, where you graduated with a bachelor's in human biology. You then went on to complete your MD and PhD in immunology at the University of Washington. So, there was a little bit of a tongue twister. I probably stitched myself up a little bit there, but
Oh,
it's
I
a
think you did great.
hell of a story. Hell of a story. I'd love to kick things off with a little bit more of an insight into what THAXA is and ultimately why you started this company.
Um, such a great question. And so THAXA is my coaching practice. And really in that practice, I work with high performing people. Often they're in leadership positions who are trying to do challenging things where there's uncertainty and risk involved. And my goal is to help them use performance science to help them level up their skills, level up their results. Um, Particularly when they're at a place where, like working harder or working more is like no longer going to get them gains, right? Like they're already working really hard. So, um, that's like the short story of like what my practice is. Um, and in terms of why I started it, and there's sort of there's a backstory to that, and then there's also like the motivations to it. So um, I think just in terms of like the backstory, clearly I've always been kind of interested in science, and I really think like a scientist. Like I love the idea that you can figure things out, that problems are solvable, and I think that is very true, kind of in the human realm as well. I think a lot of us are setting goals for ourselves and want to challenge ourselves, and we're trying to figure out like how to do that better. And I think one of the things that really drew me to performance science was this idea that, hey, there's all these ideas out there, like a lot of different disciplines from the business schools to like sociology, psychology, the productivity movement. There's a lot of different people, smart people thinking about this and studying this. And so there's all this information that we can use. And as you probably know, like when there's a lot of information, that's helpful. That's a resource, but also kind of the devil is in like distilling that so you can actually use it. Like so, real people can actually apply it and do something with it. And so, I think part of the inspiration around taking the science as a starting place for a coaching practice was this idea of saying, can you distill it? Can you get to some principles or a way for all of us to just understand it, um, and to not have to be like an academic about it, and then be able to use it to produce better results?
Yeah.
How do you really do that? And so that's kind of the inspiration for it. Um, but yeah.
I can definitely see how your background then transitioned into this company. I'm really intrigued because for me in coaching, there is endless amounts of material and study and so many different frameworks ultimately
Yes.
in how you
Mhm.
can help someone and how you can serve them. So for you, how did you whittle that down? Because if I've read 1,000 articles, that means you must have read 10,000. So how have you broken that down to ultimately the foundations and what's that core framework that then you
Yeah.
use to serve people?
Well, if you had to say like, what's the process?
Mhm.
The word I would use is iterative. So I think it's so easy for us to look around and be like, oh, like, that person who produced that result or wrote that book or whatever it is, like, oh, they must have just had this moment of insight and then
Mhm.
it was all magic from there. And, I always like to be a voice of like, what does high performance actually look like? Because generally, I think it takes longer and it's messier than often we're led to believe when we're like, seeing things in the news or someone's blogging about it. Or
Yeah.
so the process was definitely iterative. And I would say it started long before I actually started my coaching practice. So, as you sort of alluded to, prior to getting into coaching, I got an MD, I got a PhD. During that time, I also actually played like really high level sports. So simultaneously, I was playing ultimate frisbee, which is kind of a fringe sport, but there are a bunch of us that played at a high level, and I won multiple national championships. So there was kind of this process where I was using myself as a guinea pig because I always felt like when I put myself in challenging situations, like if I could just get in the arena with a bunch of other really smart people or a bunch of really like talented athletes, that I would become better. It almost like forces you to get there.
Yes.
And the other thing is you look around and then you suddenly like, I'm not trying to say that I view all of life as lab, except that that is kind of true. Like I'm always looking around, seeing like, what's everybody doing? Not from a standpoint of like that everything you see other people do that then you should do that because that's a really bad strategy, but you can learn a lot watching people's results and watching what are the habits that they use, as long as you're getting enough of a sample size
Yeah.
that you know you don't see someone some successful startup entrepreneur eat blueberries for breakfast and then conclude that like, blueberries is the
Superfood.
secret
Yeah,
superfood.
there it is.
Yeah. So I think a big piece, even prior to like sitting down and saying, okay, what's the framework going to be, was my own life experience.
Mhm.
And so, for example, some principles that like I learned were, um, if you need to think about like who are the people that you're interacting with and exposing yourself to, like you like if you can get contact with or build relationships with people who are really operating at a high level, like there's some things you can learn from them also. Like they might be good people to have in your network as you're trying to build some influence, for example.
Yep.
I think another thing I really learned was this idea of, and this is from my PhD advisor. So I was in an immunology lab, which is still very useful information for me. During COVID, I was like sort of a sidelines expert for friends and family. But I also use it. I'm an angel investor. And so I think a lot about biotech. So
Yeah.
I use that a lot. But one of the interesting things about learning to do science, whatever the science is that it teaches you how to think about a problem that doesn't have an obvious playbook or solution to it. And the whole point of doing it is no one's done it before. And so, like in that way, it's actually kind of similar to entrepreneurship. Um, you could say that the scientific method is not unlike, when we think about lean startup
Yeah.
techniques, like make an MVP based on a hypothesis, send it out there as quickly and cheaply as possible, get some feedback, and then iterate, right?
Love it.
But my PhD advisor, one of the things he would always tell me is like, you really got to focus on like, what's the thing you want to learn? Like, what's most important? Don't spend your time like trying to like dot the I's, cross the T's, do some little stuff on other people's work. Like, what's the thing you want to do that's going to be your
Powerful.
thing? Yeah.
Like
So,
it. Okay,
yeah.
so I got a question. You mentioned
Yeah.
about the difference actually between social media and then real life for high performance.
Mhm.
I mean, Treed, what do you see as those distinctions between someone who's, showing up on social media and an actual real high performer? What's the difference that you see?
Well, that's a great question. And the truth is, they can be one and the same.
Okay.
It's actually a little more about what is our, as the viewer, perception
Mm,
of what's happening.
yes.
So that's a little more. And granted, there are people on social media who are mostly just social. And
Yeah.
well, actually, we could say they are high performing at social media, which is a skill. And
Yes.
actually, it's a really important skill. And when we get down to like my really distilled principles of performance, like we can tie that back in, why that actually matters and why that is a skill. Now, they may also be producing something else, which is a different area of their performance, right? Like maybe they run a company, or maybe they've built a whole business
Mm,
um, around their content, and whether it's recommending products or whatever it is. But for us as a viewer, I think what's really important is what are the decisions we're making, or the beliefs we're forming about what we should do, what we should want. Secondly, about what's most important for what we want, and sort of what's happening to us based on the fact that we now have access to billions of people, but only a small slice of those billions is existence.
yeah.
We get their best looking picture, right, on their best hair day. We get, we get the good thing, the little tweet about the good thing that happened or the big deal they closed. But what we don't get, no one tweets about the 9 deals they didn't close on the way to that one. And so, yes,
Can't say that out loud, right?
I know.
Have those low stake
Um,
behaviors, and you can't admit that you failed at something and had no shows, and people said no and it was too expensive.
yeah,
And
some of it's definitely that, right? Like that ego piece. But I think the other thing is that things that make news have to be kind of like dramatic or
Mhm.
stimulating. And I think one of the challenges is, even if someone is humble enough to say, listen, this is the reality, and literally put their numbers
Yeah.
publicly, I think one of the challenges is it doesn't necessarily make good news. So I'm not saying people are only filtering out of ego. I think there's also,
Makes sense.
and yeah,
I've actually, when you bring that up, I've actually noticed more and more people starting to actually share their data from their business, because then if you're doing the right thing, and let's say, for example, your retention rate is through the roof, like that's actually very, very helpful from a marketing perspective. So I've actually
yes,
started to see more transparency in some of that, some of the data. You mentioned about the principles of high
yeah.
performers. So I'm really intrigued. What would be your description or
Mm-hmm.
your overview of what a high performer looks like?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about sort of how did we distill and like get there. Some of it was kind of observations over personal experience and stories. But another piece of it was really looking at, again, kind of the field and saying thematically, what are the hot spots in the
Mhm.
field, and how do I think these ideas group, and then do they match up, like do they pass the test, right? Like, am I like, this makes sense based on my own experience, or like, this seems odd. So the way I think about it, just more generally, and this is sort of performance science as a whole, is that you've got ideas grouped around the idea of strategy.
Mhm.
So like, of all the things you're thinking about doing for your business, for your
Yeah.
life, like what you know what are the right things to do that give you the most impact versus all the stuff you could do. I mean, like, uh, Oliver Berkman, he has this great book called 4,000 Weeks, and it's like time management for mortals. And he makes this point that there's like billions of lives we will not live. And oh, amazing. So, little plug here. I thought it was a great book. It is a philosophical book written by a productivity guru.
Yes.
And, but he makes this great point that the truth is we are going to live like one of a billion lives we could.
Mhm.
And so really what makes our life, I think he uses the word like shining and unique, is like the choices we make, the trade-offs. So
Powerful.
there's a bunch of ideas then that become really important about strategy. What are the few things you're going to do out of the billions of things you could? The second big hotspot, I think, is around execution. And that is really about like, how do you do those things that you've chosen effectively and efficiently? So, there's not just kind of a lot of wasted resources or time. And then I think that third hotspot of ideas is about mindset, things around how do we stay motivated? What mindsets or approaches allow us to better connect with and or motivate people? Where does confidence come from?
Yeah.
How do we manage a stressful situation? So if we start there, that's kind of how I think about performance science. And the first installation of how do we think about this if we're not we're not an academic. But I think that's a first useful lens to say, wow, I could impact my performance in 3 different areas by what I choose to do, my strategy, how well I do those things, or effectively do I do them, and what's my perspective? How do I view things? So that's like at a broad level. And then ultimately I said, well, then in each of those areas, what is most important? But I want to pause there because I think I like to really build, and in my coaching practice also, foundationally from like bottom up. Like, don't start with blueberries. So pause there, and then we could definitely move into like, what are the specific principles of performance?
Love that. I love that you've got those 3 pillars. The strategy, the mindset, and then also kind of a leverage and productivity aspect too. It's really, really unique. And I can see how useful that can be from an assessment point of view for you too. You can assess your clients by, those pillars, and ultimately then find their shortcomings. So when you are working with high performers, CEOs, entrepreneurs, is there a place that they are most commonly falling short?
I think what's great, and you said it very well, is that like different people have different strengths and weaknesses. I think they're very strategic minds that struggle a little bit when you have to kind of get down to the tactical, or sort of the execution part. And we can all imagine ourselves in this situation. Like we have something we like the best, right? And then once we've done that part of it, we might be like, ugh, do I have to do the rest of it? And there's different solutions to this. Obviously, part of it is like we have teams often of people. And so part of the wonderful thing is often when you're doing something at any kind of scale, we get to have other people who help us, and we don't necessarily have to do everything ourselves. But what I like about having a framework to kind of say, there's like strategy, execution, and mindset is different people have different levels of strengths and weaknesses in the different buckets, but it means that we can actually spend time in the areas that are going to help them the most. And sometimes that's amplifying a strength. But I would generally say that in areas of weaknesses, some people would say, don't worry about your weaknesses, like just focus on your strengths. And what I would say is, don't spend a lot of time trying to get your weaknesses to ever be as strong as your strengths. But I think there's a lot of life and success that is multiplicative. And what I mean by that is that if you have a 0 in any one category, like 0 times anything is 0.
Yes.
And so it's worth saying in areas of weakness, for example, maybe sometimes this comes up, like you have a brilliant founder who technically is like amazing, and really likes what they're building and all of that, does not like sales, does not want to sell, like any of that. Now, probably ultimately they are going to hire some kind of support for that. And ultimately, if they're really growing, they will have a sales team. However, if you are a founder, if you are a high-level leader in a company, you generally need to know that you will need to be involved with sales. So taking that from a 0 to a 1, understanding how it works, thinking about your value proposition, even if you're not the one who's going to go out and do it, understanding where the sales funnel is coming from. These are some like basic skills that you are going to need. You can't leave that category as a zero. And so
the baseline.
Mm-hmm.
You need the baseline across the, it still needs to be a jack of all trades, but then have those strengths that can multiply and compound considerably.
Right. And lean on those. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
With those high performers and the high level entrepreneurs, CEOs that you work with, do they still also encounter self-sabotage or limiting behaviors or limiting beliefs? Or is it you've got to kind of hold them back? I'm really intrigued.
I am of the mindset, and just from my experience, like we all feel overwhelmed sometimes. Like we all performance discount. And by that, I mean, this idea that like we may have achieved something great yesterday, but like today we're like, what's the next thing? Like that's old news. And one of the things I do with people is I actually try and help us recognize progress that's been made, because it's actually a really important source of motivation. And so if there are things that when you drive yourself really hard, that are benefits, right? Like, you never rest on your laurels. However, it also can lead to burnout when we're continually moving the goalpost. And so I think that's an important thing to consider. I think there are some things that when people are really successful that they are doing differently. And I think what's great is there are things that actually are accessible to all of us. And so, I think one of the first things, and I really encompass it in my principle of performance, and it relates back to strategy. So that category is this idea of brutal focus. And so one of the things that I see people doing when they're really successful is generally they have focus about what they're trying to accomplish. So some clarity around what's the goal? What are they trying to build? What is it not? And what's important about that? And what actually can they be flexible on? So they have some clarity about that. They also have clarity about what is most important, like crucial to getting there. Like what are the big drivers? And I'll be honest, it can't be a million different things. Like I call it brutal focus for a reason. It often feels kind of stark. And you're like, really? Those are the things that you're going to just focus on and hammer on and like just say, well, we'll kind of scrap together the rest of it, but we're going to absolutely make sure we're like on top of these things, either as a team or as an individual. Then I think the last thing is you're often left with a pile of stuff that's left over after that, and you got to decide what to do with it. And that's like, I call that the extraneous.
Nice.
So you got to like kind of just be like quick and dirty with that and say, okay, what am I just going to forget about? Like, nope. What are you going to say? Later. And then what are you going to say? Oh, we just need to take care of that like once and for all. So it's no longer, taking up brain space.
I like that. I use the framework, eliminate, automate, delegate. It's got to be one of the three for all of those tasks.
That's great. I love that because it's catchy also, right? Like these are the things we remember. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another thing about focus that is really great is that if you can actually, and the way you get to this is actually spending some time thinking about it. And it can be as simple as like, you have like Post-it notepad. I like this as my example because I'm like, nope, you don't need a big spreadsheet. You don't even need an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. It can be small, but taking a piece of your life, and this is what I do with clients when we start. We may be talking about a professional goal or a big goal. And the way we put brutal focus to it to start is to say, really, what's an outcome you want? And you don't have to start with a really big outcome. You could just pick an area of your life and say, like, what's the outcome I want? Like, is there a health thing that I'm like, you know what? I just need to get more fit. I need to be more fit than I am today. And also like, what do I think that would look like? What does that mean? Does that mean weight loss? Does that mean like more muscle gain, and just to say, or is it like, I need to eat healthier. But anyways, pick it out and kind of try and put some descriptors to what that means. And then make a list. And some people like the strategy of literally set a timer for 5 minutes and put down everything you can think of that might be important for that. So that's one strategy. That's called the just like brain dump strategy.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I find that to be useful for many of my clients. That's the way their brain works. And so we just follow anything that might be related to that. I ask a lot of questions. What about this? What about this? Like, how does that work? But we get a big brain dump. And then the goal is to come out of that to try and define like, what are 3 critical priorities? What is most important out of that list that you think would give you the biggest impact towards it? Not all the things. There's a lot of nice to haves on that list, and there's a lot of good things on that list. But we're looking for like, what are the best things? And that might be, for the time you invest, what gives you the most potent impact. And then make a list of those 3 things. And then the next step of it is really about saying, okay, well, what would the action actually look like to kind of do that priority? Like, let's actually make a really specific action and start to like then go forward to put that into play, which we could talk about more later. But brutal focus is often, again, start at the foundation, set yourself up right to say, what is most important? And then if it's tricky to figure out how to do that thing, that's okay. But that's the game you want to play. You want to figure out how to do that thing that's most important versus, well, these other things that are less important are easy to do. How about I just go do those things? And then you're going to do a bunch of work, but you're not going to see the impact you want. So that's why, like, start with a foundation of focus, figure out what's most important.
I love ultimately the simplicity of it, because we all have a tendency to overcomplicate some of these things, and that overwhelm comes into play. And it's that brain dump. It's such a simple framework, but it works so well. Something that's massively helped me in my coaching is creating my own, ultimately, like, coaching Bible. And it's just a complete manual of all the different frameworks that I've learned over the years. And it's just like tools to my tool belt that when I'm having these conversations, I can, this is the framework I need to serve this person. And that's really helped. And I'm going to assume that this brain dump is just one of 1,000 frameworks that you've probably got stored away. What's been one of the best client transformations that you can share that you've had, and ultimately, like, why was that transformation so powerful and so good?
People transform in different ways. And again, because depending on like what area you get insights in, it looks a little different. But I would say some of the easiest ones to think about or understand are where, and I'll use this focus as an example, because all of my client engagements start with this 5-hour virtual retreat where we like have lots of time to go deep. And the little exercise that I talked about of saying like, take your Post-it note and do this, that is a small bite-sized form of like what we do for much bigger goals. But you need both, right? Like sometimes there is something worth spending 5 hours really getting into. Often there's plenty of stuff in our life that we could make a big impact in if we spent 5 minutes and a 3x3 Post-it. So I just like to point out that like performance can go up and down the stack, and you kind of want to be able to do that. So, in one story I'm thinking about, like, and often we have insights in this first strategic session because we actually take time to get through. Like in the first hour, you get through layer 1 of like all the urgent stuff, everything that's kind of top of mind about the goal that they have. And maybe even with the goal itself, some of the like, I should want this, like, here's the shiny thing I think I want, but and then you get to, and then you get to hour 2 and I just keep like asking questions. We kind of are looking at the goal from all the different angles. And, but like, by hour 3, what happens is we really can start to connect some dots that were not connected before. And so what's really powerful is when someone has an insight that actually leads to a very quantitative outcome. There are obviously many outcomes around personal growth and performance that are a little less, that are harder to quantitate. But in this example, it was an entrepreneur who had a goal of selling his company in about 3 years' time and was trying to figure out like how to plan ahead for that, how to maximize purchase price, and ultimately had an insight. I think around hour 3, this is typically like when it happens, where he realized that the most important thing he needed to do was to aggressively raise prices and to do so immediately.
Wow.
And went out and did that and like increased the purchase price of the company by 10 million 3 years later when he was successful at that. And it's like these things, it's funny. There is this beautiful, I don't know if you experience this in coaching, but when you have someone who can ask questions and listen, and actually when you have to explain something to someone, like the business and your goal, and someone is listening and asking questions, who also has some frameworks, right? Like you have this whole tool belt. I have some frameworks that I'm thinking about from a performance science lens. And when you have to explain it, part of what happens is all of it gets out of our brain and we can see it in a different way. And we often stumble across these things where, like I think I was probably asking a lot of questions about, well, explain how this works. And, when you're really forced to do that, your brain puts some things together. So like, that's just one example, but, I think there are other examples, and some of these relate more into the process. But I guess I'll say one last thing is when we start with brutal focus, what often happens immediately, even though no one's done any different behaviors, they haven't gotten started, but when you have some mental clarity, it makes everything feel so much better. I know it's really hard to stop and think when you feel like you hardly have enough time to do. But one of the things I recommend to everyone, and in coaching, you have this beautiful protected time to do it. So that's one of the great reasons to get a coach, is because often that is what creates the time for you. But when you can stop and think and distill and get to some clarity or some focus, suddenly lots of things become easier. Sometimes you eliminate problems because you're like, that's not really actually a problem anymore. Sometimes you also find that it's become easier to communicate, like with your board of directors or with your team, because if you have mental clarity, suddenly everyone else like understands you better. And so there's these other really kind of repeatable things I see happening after people take that time, either with me, but it can happen on your own also. When you take that time to say, oh, suddenly, the goal of getting fit has been broken, and now is a very clear set of action items that I need to do consistently. Yeah, it's very approachable.
I love that you mentioned when you're asking questions, and that for me was kind of like almost like journaling out loud with them for that coaching relationship.
Such a beautiful way to put it.
And for me, a way to describe coaching is almost like the art of communication or the art of questioning and then silence. It's allowing people to have that time to think and to then gain that clarity. But you mentioned that brutal focus, and something that's been so important for me has been that environment. And it's very clear you create such this powerful environment for someone to stop and think. And if they're a high-level CEO, they've got all these things going on, it's very common they don't have that time. They don't take that time. So you providing that environment for them to gain that clarity, can be so important. And obviously, then the quantifiable numbers afterwards is the tail end, which is great. So you taking through this process of brutal focus, what comes next? Because obviously the clarity's there, then what?
Well, and clarity is an ongoing process. So that's a disclaimer we should make here. It's not like, great, we're done with the brutal focus part. That's it. Yeah. So brutal focus, I always start there because, again, everything else goes much more smoothly. So after that, I think the second principle of performance, once you're starting to say, and you're thinking about executing, is this idea of like, how do you cultivate power and influence? And there's a couple different parts of that, but I bring this up because I think another thing that high performers do well, and also that's a common mistake that can sometimes stand between people and being successful, even when they're actually producing great results, is this idea that if nobody sees your results, often it's like your results don't exist.
Yeah.
And so there are some places like athletics where it's so easy to measure performance just alone that pretty much if you are like a really fast runner, like you will be, and you enter races, like you will be discovered. But in so much of life and business, like you can provide a great product or service, but unless people are aware of it, unless the network has a perception of you, then it's going to be challenging to actually be successful, even though you might be performing at a high level. And this really goes back to your question that you said about like the social media. Like when you see someone who, like, I don't know, is very active on social media, that is actually a skill. And that is a visibility skill. And so one of the things that I always like to think about as people are working towards their goal, and it's a lens we look through. It's not prescriptive, it's not tactical, but it's to say, where do we need to think about where your influence, and are you building enough power or influence to get the job done that you need to get done? And there's a couple different ways to look at this. One of the first is that sometimes you need to build your skills. There might be knowledge gaps or skill gaps, but you need to think about how you can improve in those areas to be able to kind of have the influence that you want to have. And then I think the second area, so if there are things like that, I often ask that question to say, where are there, because I am such a proponent of us having kind of universal growth mindset, like that we can learn and grow in any area as long as our brains conceive that we can do that. So, so there is that. So I'm often looking for those things, and often people self-identify those things, like, oh, I hate sales. And they're like, okay, we're going to talk about that and figure out, how you can learn enough to be dangerous and to do what you need to do for that. But I think the second piece is this idea of saying, what visibility do you need? How do you need to self-promote, whether you're within a big company, and even if you're producing great results? This question is really relevant of, how are you going to showcase those in appropriate ways to appropriate people, and not just expect that people see your good work? Because we are so self-centered as human beings. We are all busy thinking about ourselves, and so it is important to say, how do you really cleanly present or showcase impact that you're making?
Yes.
So that people perceive that and connect that to you. And so I think that that's something I'm often thinking about. And depending on the situation, that can be, if you're an executive or you're working within a bigger company, that could be, your supervisor and skip level, could be your peers. But if you're running a startup, that may be, you need your investors and your potential investors to see what you're doing. You need your customer base to see what you're doing. And then just one last piece of cultivating power, and that is, you rarely do things alone. And so part of your ability to produce things is, how well have you set up your team to know how to win and to be able to contribute and to bring their talents to the thing. And so I think it's really important to sort of say, okay, does my team have clarity about what we're trying to do? Do they have clarity about how they can contribute and why they're important? Do they know kind of the rules of the game? Can they see the field as I see the field? Maybe can they point out stuff on the field that I didn't see? And can we all play the game together well? And how do I set them up to do that? Because if you want to scale, you're not going to do it alone.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you, in this aspect, you delve into all the different parts of a business, the marketing, the sales, the fulfillment, the operations, and then the management of the team, and the kind of linking all of that together. I was really intrigued. You mentioned about how everyone should have a certain level of influence and essentially developing what I would say is that personal brand.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that the case for someone who's potentially a higher level CEO, but they're not the face of the company? Do they still need to develop that level of influence, or is that just influence within the team?
I love that you're pointing out the subtleties in the word influence. And
Yeah.
I think this is where the principles always overlap. So,
Yeah.
for example, this is a great place to say, okay, for a given individual, we should think in a focused way about what kind of influence is most impactful for them. And as you pointed out, rightly so, that may look different from, if you are the CEO and the face of a company, and what you want to be representing versus what does like the CTO need to be representing. And by the way, that can be different. I wouldn't even say that there's one thing for CTOs and there's one thing for CEOs. I would say it depends on your company, depends on the industry. And so it's very useful. And again, I like the principles, and I like starting from first principles because they're not prescriptive, but they help us look at situations and say what makes sense here and what's going to help here. And so, for someone who's maybe a different, let's just talk about two different scenarios. Like one could be, like you need to be out there representing the company. And so maybe you need a strong social media brand, both like from the customer side, but also like as a social proof for your investors that they feel like they invested in something that's like out there and doing well. And then, you do need also, like, you are running a team. So that internal is important as well. One example is, if you were more on the technical front, it might be more important for you to be seen as like a technical expert. And you certainly need technically to be connecting with the team. But maybe in this particular scenario, you look at it and you say, actually, I need to be thinking about, and maybe not publishing every day, but once a quarter, putting out a really impactful kind of technical opinion piece.
Nice.
And that is what I need. So again, I'm, these are not prescriptive. I don't blindly follow these things. It's meant to be more of a, how do you use these principles to sort of think about what's going to help you and make an individually best decision for yourself?
I like that. So it starts with that brutal focus, gaining ultimately true clarity, or as much clarity as we can in that given moment, about those next steps. Then we lean into cultivating power, understanding that leverage and the productivity, and ultimately, what are those actual steps? What comes after that? They've now got clarity. They know what they need to do. They know the next steps. What comes next?
The next thing is relish uncertainty. So this Cultivate Power kind of links back to that execution bucket.
Yeah.
And relish uncertainty links back to that mindset bucket.
Okay.
So you get as much clarity as you can. You try and build the influence you're going to need to like actually get stuff done. And then like you got to see what happens and you kind of got to roll with it. So I have found like one of the most important mindsets, particularly when you're trying to like live big and work big and just kind of really go after those dreams that you have, is, gosh, we got to tackle uncertainty. And because I think actually that's where there's a lot of growth and opportunity. And I also know that I think human beings, we are at our best and we are thriving the most when we are growing, when we are not stagnant.
Yeah.
And also, I think when we're willing to let ourselves try things and iterate, and like there's going to be some mess, but to know that we can we can move forwards, we can grow. And I think, this is something, so from my past, I observed that, so I often had like a bunch of different things going at once, like whether it was like ultimate Frisbee and getting a PhD, or maybe it was, like in college, like I rode crew in college and was doing all, the academic stuff also. But one of the things it taught me is that when you're willing to do several different things at once, you're forced to focus to what's most important, because you
Mhm.
really don't have time to do anything but that.
Become more efficient.
Well, you do. You also learn to accept a certain amount of mess.
Yeah.
Like there was this one time, I forget. So I was both doing some PhD stuff and med school stuff at the same time. It was like finals week. I think I was leaving for a conference, and I almost missed my ride to the airport, but like had stayed up late getting everything ready, and then got in the car, and then we got to the airport, and I said, hold on, I got to drop off these bills in like the little postal box at the airport. And he was like, I hate people like you. He's like, yeah, he's like, I don't know how you're doing all this
Doing
stuff, but
so
like
much.
you still paid your bills, even though you nearly slept through like me,
Love
coming to pick you up.
Love it. The
But
life of a high performer
it's,
right there.
well, it's accepting mess in areas where you can tolerate some mess.
Mm.
And then, but I think part of the reason that we struggle with that is because we want control. Our human brains want control, and we want certainty that stuff is
Yep.
going to work out. And we often don't start a new habit because we want that so badly.
Yeah.
And so this is why relishing uncertainty, and I have some tips about how do you do that, rather than just say like, okay, relish uncertainty, start now.
So, I mean, I'd love to know. I'd love to know what's that initial step, because ultimately that's how someone can take that big leap, is
Yeah.
relishing that uncertainty. So I'd love to know, what does that process look like for you? Someone who's on the edge right now and they know that there is that leap that they've got to take. How do they
Mhm.
have that confidence to make that leap?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I like to talk about is having a mindset of abundance. And here's what that means to me. I think it means that you can acknowledge that there is more than one good way to get somewhere, that your path does not have to be like linear and straight. Most are not. When you, this goes back to something we were talking about earlier. When you hear the story after the fact, we retell this story in this way that it's like, oh, it was a foregone conclusion that whatever, I was going to be famous. But it usually doesn't happen like that in real time. So there's more than one good way to get someplace. And then the second piece is there's more than one great place to get to. Like often we have this really focused idea about where we want to get to. And the truth is, maybe what actually happens, which could be far off what we had planned, takes us to someplace even better.
Mm-hmm.
I hear a
Nice.
lot of stories about this, and I also see it happening with my clients. Where maybe they were like high up in a company, but had some dreams and ideas about something else they wanted to do, and ultimately like weren't able to like do as much of that as they wanted in the company they were in. And so then they went and opened their own consulting practice, like, and are living the dream. So it's just things like that can really happen. So that I think that's helpful is step one.
I love that. I really like the visual, and this is how I've kind of described it in the past, is that we set that initial goal, and then that's our target, and we're gonna fire a torpedo at that target. And what's going to happen, that torpedo is going to adjust and change. It's not a straight line, and
Mhm.
over time it's going to change. But what's important is you hit fire, you start. This is step one. You take the leap, and
Mhm.
only once you've done that will you know that you're actually on that right path.
Well, and there's an amazing thing about getting moving,
Mm-hmm.
which is that like I came back from a sailing trip also recently, and
Yeah.
I'm not a sailor, so I learned a lot about sailing. And one of the things about sailing is that if water is not flowing over the rudder, you cannot steer. So like as you're tacking through the wind, changing from a port tack to a starboard tack, you have to keep turning relatively quickly, because if you get stuck directly upwind, the boat stops and you can't steer it. And then you got to do all these
Good stuff.
shenanigans to get it back.
Yep.
That's my technical word. That's my sailing word.
I
There are
like it.
shenanigans
I like
that you
it.
have to do to get back moving again. So I love this idea of get started, build some momentum, because then you can adjust your course. But if you're not started, all the adjusting is in your head, and all that is like ruminating. So, you know, what about this? What about that? What about this? So, so I love that example of say, got it, like for in yours, push fire.
Yeah,
get going.
absolutely love it. I love that you.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you there. I love that you brought up your actual sailing trip, and I know this may be a little bit off tangent, but I've seen the deliverables of your coaching and how you structured, how you serve and help people. I love the amount of balance and ultimately, to a certain extent, freedom that you have created for you in your personal life. You know, you've got this incredibly successful business, but then also you still have created a way that you have some freedom. Like, what has been your approach for that? Because I see that as very different to some other CEOs and high-level entrepreneurs that want to build these massive, massive empires. So I'm really intrigued by that. And it's super impressive what you've managed to do.
Well, thank you. And I will say, like, depending on what you want to build, like there are some realities that you can't bully. So I like to bring that up, that there are, you know, if you want to build a very large company and take it public and do that, that is going to look different than, and what are the most important elements for that are going to look different from like building a coaching practice and what I have done. But I think one of the things that really compels me, and part of the influence, again, of like, I was studying general surgery before I decided not to do medicine and actually to really follow this kind of deeper passion for performance. That is totally what took me into surgery also in the first place. But is I really like having a multi-channel life. So for me, and I think you probably heard that coming when I talked about how I was always saying, yeah, I want to do something really challenging academically. Guess what? I also want to be like very physically active. I want to play sports, not just amateur sports, but if there's a medal to be won, like I want to go win that, you know, and I want to train appropriately for it. And so I think there was a piece of me that always knew that I wanted that multi-channel life to be healthy, like to have a good relationship. But I also love ambitious, challenging, thoughtful work that is stimulating. And I think what that forces me to do is to really like live brutal focus, to define like what is most important for that. How much time do you actually need to invest in your health or your fitness, you know, particularly as you get older, to really have that piece be where it can be. And then what does that mean about how potent do your work activities have to be in terms of your enjoyment of them, the financial rewards of them. And you'll notice, for example, anyone who goes to my social media may be like, where were you for the past 10 years? And I will tell you, that was a deliberate choice. There were a number of people who told me when I started my practice that I needed to blog, I needed to get on the social media train. There were all these things I needed to do. And I looked at everything and I said, well, as I'm starting, I need to make sure my coaching is top quality, because that's the making stuff.
That's everything.
And it will ultimately, you need to have happy clients to have more clients. But I also said, and you need to learn how to sell and how to do whatever prospecting you're going to do to, and business development to, you know, have people want to try you as a coach. And so I really focused on those two activities. And I did not blog, I did not post, I did none of those things. And ultimately it taught me a lot. I got much better at really having a good conversation with someone. We'll call it a sales conversation because that in fact is what it is, but to really figure out if I would be a good fit for them. I learned how to do cold outreach. I networked a lot, you know, and these are all skills that now I feel very confident at, but they didn't teach me that in med school.
Yeah.
So, but it is really helpful because I think ultimately focus is challenging, and I'm telling my clients to do it, and I'm trying to help them find ways to do it, but to let go of some of the stuff, you have to do that. And I'll tell you, in that extraneous bucket, no one here in your audience wants to hear the whole list, but there's a bunch of stuff on that list that's like, what, like how much of the like stuff, all the stuff around the house or this or that, like that, how much you can concern yourself with that versus like, all right, or cooking something fancy, like, did I eat something healthy? Like, and, can I walk through the house without, running into something? Okay, great. House is clean and I ate. But these are just examples of there's a lot of extraneous stuff that builds up on our to-do lists. So
I think you're the actual role model, and you're living what I would expect a lot of your clients are striving for too. So I think that's just a credit to yourself. I'm intrigued. What are you currently working towards? What's next for either THAXA, or what is coming for you?
That's a great question. So, perhaps as I pointed out, like I had a real focus for the first 10 years of help as many people as I could, really refine my coaching, and then also to just understand like how to build the business in its most potent form, right? And ultimately, since the pandemic, my coaching has gone entirely virtual. It was partially virtual before, but now it's all virtual. And as a piece of that, one of the things that I have been really excited about after 10 years of coaching is actually saying, okay, these ideas that I've developed and distilled have relevancy and value beyond just a one-on-one coaching relationship. And so part of what's next for me is to say, I went into this because I love seeing people do awesome stuff. And our world is better when people are out kind of living big and really living potently. And so I decided that what was next for me was to say, let's kind of take these ideas out, starting with podcast guesting, and really see what their impact is in the absence of like a direct kind of one-on-one coaching relationship. And see what is most helpful, see how you test and change them to make them more applicable. And so I think it's the beginning of the next 10 years, which is continued coaching, because I love coaching. It's not a side thing I do. It was my first love, and I continue to just really be jazzed about it. So this is kind of a next layer. Yeah.
It's sounds like a bit of a transition. And for me, what I'm hearing is that you're looking to ultimately help and serve more people from that transition. So that's really exciting. What would be the best way for someone to get in contact, or to learn a little bit more? All of your links and socials will be down below, but where would be the best place for someone to go?
I think the best place to learn about coaching would be my website. And so that's at THAXA.com. And I think that, so through the site, my contact info is there, but you can also message me through that site. And there's a lot of FAQs if you just want to read, but also if it's something people are more actively looking into, I'm always happy to set up an intro call. So that's something you can message me about, and we can talk a little more about it.
Love it. And then I actually have a question that I ask every single one of my guests that comes on the show. And the question is, what advice would your future self give you in this current moment?
I think my future self would tell me to like keep going fast. It's fun and exciting. And also, like, when you're going fast, there's so many things that you just like don't give a second thought to.
I like,
and there's so much that can distract us, can make us feel bad about ourselves, all the things, right? And so it's like, nah, just keep going fast, because when you're going fast, you have to focus on just steer. Like,
Amazing.
yeah.
Such a great answer. Carl, I want to just express my gratitude for you coming on the show. You've got so much knowledge. You have a really unique way of piecing together these very complicated things. And I think what you're doing with your company, having worked in the coaching industry for a very long time and seen the behind the scenes of lots of different businesses, the setup you have, what you're doing, the results you're delivering is off the charts. So that's exciting. And I'm excited for that next 10 years that you have coming up, where you're going to start to impact and serve more people. So again, thank you for coming onto my show. I'm sure the guys that are listening will have gotten an incredible amount of value. And yeah, hopefully we get to do this again sometime.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Samuel. This is great.
My name is Samuel Main, and I truly hope that you've got value from today's video. If you have, please do hit like and subscribe down below, and I'll see you in the video tomorrow.